In today's tutorial, we are going to paint this vibrant, expressive loose watercolor floral composition step by step. This lesson is actually pulled from my brand new class that just launched called 15-Day Floral Watercolor Challenge, Create Compositions with Confidence. So if you enjoy this tutorial, you can join the rest of the 15 days of florals inside that class, and I will have the link for you down below in the description box. So let's jump into this tutorial. As always, the supplies are linked below, so be sure to check that out to see exactly what brushes and colors I'm using. Okay, so we are going to start with the top left flower, and what I'm going to do is I'm taking my size 5 brush and my cadmium yellow deep, and I'm going to do a few tiny little marks. This is just for the very center of the flower. You're barely even going to see it, so I'm barely placing those in. Just a few little dots using the tip of my brush. And now we're going to paint the petals, and we're going to do it in a very similar way to how we did it in the day 3 project with the yellow flower that we did with those rounded loose petals. So I'm taking my purple mixture and I'm going to make sure I have plenty of pigment and water in my brush. And just like we did in that project, I'm making tiny little marks around the yellow dots that I just put in. And I don't really want these to bleed together yet, so I'm keeping a bit of distance between the yellow and the purple. I'll rinse off my brush completely, and it's the same technique where you pull out and then bring it back in. Pull out, bring it back. I'll show you on this first petal, pulling out the color and bringing it back. I want that to be a little darker. Go over it one more time, out and back. And you can see that creates a very beautiful fluffy petal. Now I'm going to go ahead and tap in a little bit more color here. You'll see it bleed out into the petal a little bit, which is totally fine. Again, I want you to be able to see this well on screen. And so anytime I work with super light colors like this, it doesn't come across as vibrant as I'd like on screen. So I'll do that again, pulling out some of that color, letting my brush expand, and bringing it back to the center. Now, as I create these petals, sometimes I go over it a couple more times. Sometimes I add wispy marks in between, and I just give these petals a little bit more character. Let's move to the left side, pulling out some color and bringing it back. So you're just doing a little loop-de-loop. Brush expands out and I bring it right back, keeping your wrist nice and loose to create these expressive petals. And as you paint your petals, make sure that they don't all look the exact same. So this one's a little thicker, this one's thinner and more curvy. This one on the side is going to be a little bit smaller. Same technique for all of them of coming out and pulling back in, but just giving a slight variation to each of them. I'm going to smooth out this edge a little bit, but as you practice these techniques, it might feel a little bit weird at first and it doesn't feel very natural or fluid. But as you practice that and you do them more and more and you paint more compositions, it really starts to become a natural process and a natural technique, and that's because of muscle memory. When you do things often like this, you learn how your brush works, you learn how to move your hand in different ways, and you know what strokes work best for your style. So you can already tell my color is kind of drying up here, so I'll add a little bit more into the center. But yeah, all that to say, just don't give up on yourself. I know lots of times when you're watching other people paint, it looks maybe like it's a lot more effortless than it maybe feels to you right now. But I promise you, with some practice and repetition, it'll start to come naturally. And you can also infuse your own style into your paintings the more you learn what you like and what you don't like. So there's our first flower. Now the next one's going to be to the right, and it'll be a side perspective. And we're going to do opposite colors for this one. So the first one, I had the yellow in the middle and the purple petals. This time we'll do it in reverse. And because I want this second flower to be more of a side perspective, when I add these initial strokes, I'm very gently adding them, and they're in much more of a flattened oval shape than the initial yellow ones we did on the previous flower. just barely adding that touch of color. And now we'll do the same process, but in reverse. So I'm going to take a good amount of the cadmium yellow deep and do the same thing that we did with the purple. Starting by adding in pretty heavily pigmented marks here so that I'll have plenty to pull from. I'll do a little bit here on the bottom, but I want majority of it to be up there at the top or on the right. I'm going to rinse off my brush so I have clean bristles, and I'm going to do the same exact thing. Now when I do my sideways perspective ones, I want the petals on the left or the bottom to be a little bit shorter than the ones on the top. So I'll start with the big fluffy petals, expanding the brush and bringing it back. Let's do that again. Pull out color, leave a little bit of white space in between your petals, and create these big, fluffy, expressive petals. I'm making sure to rinse off my brush every time so that I'm not creating petals that are too saturated, because those bristles pick up pigment every time you do a petal. Let's create this side one. I'll rinse off my brush again. I'll do one more kind of here on the side, butting up next to the purple petals. A little one here on the bottom. And then this petal at the very bottom, it's just going to be kind of a horizontal shape. It's not a full fluffy petal like the others. Now let's do our next flower placed down at the bottom. We're working in the rule of odds. It's a little bit easier sometimes to do it that way. And I'm going to go ahead and add my third and final primary flower. And I want the center to be somewhere in between these two. And this one's going to be facing more downwards. So they're all kind of facing slightly different directions. Adding the smaller yellow strokes first before I go in with a very pigmented, very bold mixture of lavender. You can also play around with different values of the purple. If you want it to be a little bit more smoky, then you can add carbon black or Payne's gray. If you want it to be more of a pink hue, you can add more of the quinacridone lake or whatever pink you're using in your mixture. Just have fun with it and try different ratios. Now let's start adding the petals, doing the same technique, pulling that color out and bringing it back in, and creating these really fun, expressive petals. And you can see the center of this final flower is quite a bit bigger, so it'll have a little bit of a different look to it. And that's something I always try to do in my compositions. I never want all my flowers to look identical, because if you have a real floral bouquet in real life, you know that not all the flowers look the exact same. So I try not to overthink it. And especially when you work with quick brush movements like we're doing in this project, it's pretty difficult to have identical looking flowers anyways. When you try to do it too carefully and too perfect looking, then you might run into the problem of having all your flowers look the exact same. So keep your wrist loose, keep your grip on your brush loose, and make these petals expressive and fun. Now before I add any filler flowers or other details, I'm going to do my base layer of greenery. With my base layers, I start super light value. It's a very watery mixture, and I just kind of lay down some initial big fluffy leaves. And this is just to fill it in a bit and start to build out that shape, and then we'll go back in and add fillers. And for the fillers, we'll bring back some more of this yellow to kind of balance it out. We have a lot of purple, so we want to bring back some yellow, and we'll also add in some of that pink as well. But for now, I just like to fill it up a little bit more with these first layers of leaves. I'm also making it known that all of these flowers are connected by adding some of this green in between them. And when I do these, I'm not even painting a perfect leaf shape necessarily. I'm just filling in some of that white space and blocking in that color so that you can imagine that there is greenery down below. And I'm also making sure that I keep this value very light because I want to be able to add darker layers on top. If I start too dark for this initial step, then I won't leave enough room for myself to go any darker when I add additional layers of greenery. So keeping it nice and light, that way you can always build layers on top. And again, when I do these, I don't have necessarily an exact plan in mind for where all of these leaves are going to go. I'm just feeling it out and filling up some of this space, making sure all the movement is displayed in these leaves and making sure it feels balanced. So that's looking good, and now I'm going to break out my good old pencil again to start planning where I want these filler elements to go. I'm liking this movement so far from top corner to bottom corner. We have some of a curve there. We have a little bit coming off to either side, but for the most part, it's a corner to corner composition, which, as we talked about in the beginning, is a great way to establish movement. Now, usually when I like to add these, I start penciling them in, and I like to add, let's say, purple or pink fillers coming out of yellow. I wouldn't want to do a yellow flower with yellow fillers. Just like on the left side, I want my fillers to be yellow or pink. I wouldn't want them to be purple because it's already pretty heavy on purple on the left side. Like we talked about, balance. We want to make sure we have balance with our colors as well. So I have some coming out up there. I'm going to have one coming up on the side and blocking in where I want all of these little filler flowers to go. Again, I never sketch out full flower shapes or anything like this. I'm just sketching out the stems and where all of those are going to go and where we're going to see the movement in the piece. Now let's load up some yellow and start on the fillers. I'm going to start by tapping in a base layer like this. Even that's a little bit more pigmented than I would like, but just make sure it's a nice light value and haphazardly start tapping in the base layer for this first filler. And then while it's still wet, I'm going to go back in with a very concentrated value, very similar to what we did in the center of the yellow flower. And I'm going to start tapping it in, and you can see it bleeding and interacting with that first layer. I don't want to add too much. I still want to be able to see that light value, but just tapping in that bold, vibrant value. Let's do the same thing down at the bottom, starting pretty light, leaving some white space in between all these little marks. You want your fillers to have some room to breathe, and then going back in with the darker pigment, not overlapping every single part that we did in the first layer, but just adding to it. And now let's move on to some pink fillers. I definitely want to have one down here at the bottom. I'll have one purple one coming out on the right to balance out the color on the left, and then some more pink up at the top. Since we're not using pink in the main flowers, I want to make sure I have plenty for the fillers. Again, starting with the light value and very gently tapping in the first layer. That's even a little bit darker than I'd like. I'll rinse some of that off and continue adding these light little marks. Now let's take some of that deep pink and tap it in, let it interact with that first layer. Let's do some more of that pink. I'm going to have some coming out up at the top. Once again, starting with that first layer, tapping my brush down, and we'll have 2 sprigs for this one. And then go in with the second layer straight from the tube. It's a very bold mixture, and tapping it in right on top. And make sure to have fun with it, especially when you're taking classes and you're just experimenting and learning new techniques. It's really low pressure and it's important to have fun. So I'm adding this purple filler on the right side to create the sense of balance since we have so much purple on the left side. And you always want that first layer to still show through on these fillers. So when you add your second layer, just make sure you're not adding too much. Now I really like how this pink filler has 2. It has the shorter one and the taller one. So I'm going to add a little bit of that to some of these other elements. I'm going to go back in and add some of this yellow, tapping it down, and it looks like it's kind of peeking up behind this purple petal. Let's also do that on this one on the right, but instead of doing a purple one, I'm going to do a pink one. I feel like there's already so much purple in this piece, and I also really like how the pink looks next to the purple. And remember, you're not even painting petals necessarily. All you're doing is tapping your brush down with different amounts of pressure and letting the colors play with each other. So now let's start adding some little stems. Again, we will add more greenery and details as we go. But for now, I just want to make sure all of these elements are connected. Make sure you can tell that everything is a part of this composition. We don't want anything floating out in space by itself. And I'm just using the tip of my brush and filling in a bit of that white space in each of these fillers. I don't want any straight lines coming through them. And I'm also going to start adding some little leaves coming off of them as well. And these help to contribute with the movement of the piece. I'm not overwhelming it, but just complementing and following the direction of those fillers. This is very intuitive painting at this point. I don't have a plan for where all these little bits are going, but just seeing what is needed where and adding it to the piece as I go. So everything is looking good so far. Everything is connected. So now the last step will be adding some final greenery with a darker value. I don't want to go too dark, but definitely a step darker than that first layer. And again, some of it will be overlapping what's already there. Some of it will be adding some brand new leaves. I don't want to go overboard. There's already a lot going on in this piece, but I do want to build up some depth and sharpen the contrast a little bit. And you can do that by using a darker value of green. And you can already see that this second layer, it's not distracting, it's just adding a layer of depth and adding some contrast. Because you can still see that lighter layer beneath it, and then this darker layer on top, that's what's closer to you as you look at the bouquet. So it's darker. I'm going to tap in a little bit more of this dark green in between the little fillers. And for example, this pink one lost a little bit of the vibrancy, so I'll bring some of that back by using some darker green. So let's take another step back. I'm liking how we incorporated some of the darker elements. The only area that's still pretty light is this top right corner. So I'm just going to add a little bit more of a leaf coming out of here and embellishing that greenery a little bit. And let's also add one curving upwards. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Once again, this lesson was pulled from my new class, which is a 15-day floral challenge. That class is 5.5 hours long, and it is full of in-depth floral instructions, and you'll complete 15 beautiful compositions. So if you join that class, by the end, you will not only feel more confident with your painting techniques, you'll also become a master of creating beautiful, well-balanced compositions, which can sometimes be a bit tricky. So I would love to have you join me in that class. It is available on Skillshare and also on my website for those of you who are not Skillshare members. And again, the links to join that class are down below in the description box. Thanks again for painting alongside me today, and I will see you next time.